So the rest of chapter one, what we're mostly going to be looking at is telling different things apart, things that might be similar or easily confused. We're going to try to figure out how do you tell them apart. There's actually three groups of things that your book makes a big deal of telling apart, and we're going to focus on those one at a time. Today we're going to be talking about different ways that you can gather data. Your book talks about four main ways of gathering data. There's nothing really particularly magical about that number four, but since these are the ones that are highlighted in your book, and they are probably about the most important of ways of gathering data, they're the ones that we're going to focus on. First of those, we've already really talked a bit about. It's the idea of sampling, of using a small group to represent the whole population. I actually already talked about, for example, how Frito-Lay doesn't look at every single potato chip they produce. They look at a few that come off the line at different intervals, and that's a sample, a small group that they use to represent all their potato chips. Sampling is by far the most common method of gathering data in statistics, and it is the way that we're mostly going to focus on as we go through this class. Sometimes in statistics, it is assumed that you have a sample. In fact, sometimes they assume you have a specific type of sample. Sampling is, however, by far the most common method that there is for gathering data. If you do a sample right, you can get very good information about the population. The key word in what you see on your screen, though, is carefully. You do need to be careful when you gather a sample because there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And what we want to have happen is a sample that's as close to the whole population as it can possibly be. But sampling, small group, represents the whole group. The second key method of gathering data is a census. You probably know that 2020 is a census year for the US government. What they're trying to do is find out information about all the people that live in this country. Now, a census in general means any sample that includes the entire population. You've got to include everybody. And with a sample, you'll find the same issues we talked about in the last video, that including everybody is not often possible or practical to do. The Census Bureau runs into all kinds of problems when they try to take the census every 10 years. For example, they have issues with finding homeless people. It may be difficult to find those people. There are also people that may not be homeless, but they don't want the government to know where they are. Maybe they've evaded their taxes or committed some kind of other crime, or maybe they just don't trust the government for one reason or another. That can be an issue when they try and conduct the US Census. This year, there have been even more problems because of COVID-19. It can be very difficult to contact people and get them to finish a survey in the special circumstances that we do have this year. That's true anytime you want to have even a non-human population. It can be hard or sometimes impossible to include everything. But if you do, that's what a census is. The third way of gathering data is an experiment. And if you think about it a minute, the steps in an experiment should kind of make sense. What you do in an experiment is you take your sample, you divide it up into two groups, or sometimes more than two, but two is where we start. You're going to then treat those groups differently. And then what you want to do is see if there's any differences because of how you treated them. We, of course, live in Iowa. And in Iowa, there are tons of experiments that are done in the field of agriculture. If you drive down a rural road, it's hard to miss the signs that talk about like different varieties of corn. Or sometimes you'll see similar signs where they're testing different types of chemicals on a field. what they're doing there is an experiment. They're treating different fields differently, and they're trying to see what the results are and find if one grows better than the other does. There's some different terms that come up when we do experiments that it's useful to know. One of them is what we call the groups that we're working with in an experiment. Usually we refer to a control group and an experimental group. A control group is a group where you don't do anything out of the ordinary. You either literally do no treatment at all, or you leave things pretty much the way they've always been. The experimental group, you do something that you hope causes a change. And control group, again, yeah, you're just sort of watching and nothing special is happening. Experimental group, something is going on to create that experiment. Another set of terms that it's useful to know the difference in is observation and treatment. In order to have an experiment, there has to be treatment happening. Treatment means you do something to cause that change. If you don't, we typically call that observation. An example of a study that's just observation I had when I taught stats as a night class a few years back. I had a woman over on the Spencer campus that was going into education. And for her project, she wanted to look at the question of whether in schools boys misbehave more than girls do. Now, I've taught for a long time, and I don't know that I would necessarily say boys misbehave more than girls do. What I would say is that boys and girls misbehave in different ways. A lot of times boys can be louder when they misbehave, but girls sometimes can be more devious. And so, that's just my opinion on it. The way this woman did her project, what she did is she was doing a practicum at one of the elementary schools over in Spencer. She sat in the back of the classroom with a clipboard that had a seating chart on it. She watched the class, and every time she thought somebody misbehaved, she made a mark next to their name. And according to what she found at the end of the term, yeah, the boys misbehaved a lot more than the girls did. But that is observation. She didn't do anything to change their behavior. She just watched and recorded what she felt was misbehavior. Observation, you look. Treatment, you do something to make it happen. A couple of other terms here. A placebo, you've probably encountered that term before. And what a placebo is just a fake treatment. Placebos were first used during World War I when there were lots of injured soldiers that would come to field hospitals in severe pain. There wasn't nearly enough medicine to treat that pain. So the workers at field hospitals would inject those guys with saline solution, with salt water. They would really sell it. They would say, this is morphine. This will make you feel nothing. And they found that if you really did sell it well, yeah, a placebo could have very effective treatment. In fact, in about 66% of people, the placebo did have a significant reduction in pain. Now, placebos don't have to be medicines. They can be almost anything. There have been some interesting studies that were done with street drugs, where people would, for instance, be at a party and they would pass around something that looked like marijuana, but actually it was like a bag of oregano. And they found that if people thought that what they were using was an actual drug, they would actually act like they were high. And that's a placebo. They're taking something that's not real and thinking that it is. A lot of times, like in medicine, actual drugs are tested against placebo just because when people think they're getting a treatment, sometimes they will have a notifiable effect. Going right along with that is this term double blind. I'm going to use an example from medicine for that. Suppose that you're trying to test a drug. What double blind means is neither the doctor nor the patient knows whether this is a real treatment or a fake. Now, it kind of makes sense that the patient, you don't want to know if it's fake. Sometimes people wonder, why would it matter if the doctor does? Well, if you think about it for a minute, if the doctor knew that this was a fake treatment, they of course want to do all they can to help the patient improve. They might change some of the other aspects of the treatment they're giving, and that might have an effect on the study. So double blind, neither the person that's giving the treatment nor the person getting it knows whether it's real. The next type of means of gathering data is a simulation, and all a simulation is just a small-scale model of a real-world situation. These days, most of the time, simulations are done on computer. The very first computer simulations were flight simulators. There's a darn good reason for that. If you wreck a plane, you cost somebody millions of dollars. If you wreck a flight simulator, basically you've played a video game. So anytime you see computer in a question, it's kind of a dead giveaway. It's probably a simulation. It doesn't have to be done on computer, though. If you did like a project for the Ed Fair where maybe you made like a model volcano out of baking soda and vinegar, that's a simulation. You don't have real lava there, but it's a model of the real thing. The key word is model. You're taking something in the real world and you're making a small-scale model of it. So that's the ways that you can gather data, and we will go on from there.